There's a house on the winding streets of Beverly Hills, an old Spanish colonial once home to Hollywood royalty. Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart made this place their haven during the golden age of cinema. But the whispers about this house have little to do with its glamour. Visitors claim it's alive with echoes of the past, sometimes too alive. Emily Daniels wasn't much of a believer in ghosts. The 27-year-old interior designer had been hired to consult on restoring the Bacall Bogart residence for its latest owner, a retired tech mogul named Richard Harlow. She arrived late one evening to walk the house, armed with sketches and swatches, eager to make the project her big break. From the moment she stepped inside, Emily felt off. The air was heavy, the silence unnerving. Her heels clicked against the black and white tiled floors of the grand foyer, their echo swallowed up too quickly, as if the house itself didn't want the noise. Richard was running late, so Emily decided to explore. She wandered into the sunken living room, where Lauren Bacall was said to have thrown glamorous parties. The room still bore its original charm-beamed ceilings, a carved stone fireplace, but something about it felt wrong. She spotted a grand piano in the corner, covered in dust. Drawn to it, she ran her fingers over the keys, hitting a sour note. Behind her, a whisper, "Don't play that." She spun around. No one was there. By the time Richard arrived, Emily was pale and visibly shaken. She brushed it off as fatigue and joined him for a walkthrough. But as they moved upstairs to the bedrooms, she couldn't ignore the strange sensations, the cold spots, the faint smell of cigars, Bogart's signature indulgence, and the distant sound of laughter that seemed to come from nowhere. In the master suite, Emily noticed something odd. The walk-in closet had a false back panel, slightly ajar. She opened it to reveal a narrow staircase leading to a secret room. Richard had no idea it existed. Must have been some kind of speakeasy, he mused. The room was dimly lit by a single bulb. It was small, cluttered with old Hollywood memorabilia. Faded photos of Bacall and Bogart, cocktail glasses, and an old-fashioned record player. Emily picked up a photograph of the couple smiling, only to gasp as a shadow darted across the corner of her vision. "Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling, "did you see that?" He shook his head but looked uneasy. Suddenly, the record player crackled to life. It spun slowly, emitting distorted jazz. Emily reached for the knob to turn it off, but as soon as she touched it, the room plunged into darkness. The sound of footsteps echoed in the room, deliberate, heavy steps, circling them. Emily clung to Richard, her heart racing. Then came the voice, low and raspy. "Get out. This is our home." Emily couldn't breathe. The smell of cigars was overwhelming now, the air oppressive. Richard fumbled for his phone's flashlight, illuminating the room. They were alone, but on the dusty record player, a fresh fingerprint marked the knob Emily had just touched. Shaken, the pair left the house that night and vowed never to return after dark. Research revealed that the secret room wasn't a speakeasy, it had been a private retreat, where Bogart spent his final days battling esophageal cancer. He reportedly told Bacall he'd never leave her, even in death. Over the years, new owners have reported similar experiences, phantom smells of Lauren's perfume mingling with cigar smoke, whispers warning intruders, and doors slamming without cause. Some say the couple never left. The house remains their sanctuary, its glamour and horror intertwined, a haunting reminder that even in Hollywood, the dead refuse to fade away. Would you dare step inside? Days after their harrowing experience, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the house was pulling her back. She dreamt about it, vivid, disjointed images of Lauren Bacall standing by the grand piano, her face obscured by shadows. Each time, Bacall would whisper something Emily couldn't understand. The dreams grew more intense until, one night, Emily woke with a start. A single word ringing clear in her mind, "Come." Against her better judgment, she called Richard the next morning. "I need to go back," she said. "There's something unfinished." To her surprise, he agreed. "I've been having dreams too," Richard confessed, his voice uneasy. "But it's not Lauren I'm seeing. It's him." They returned to the house at dusk, its silhouette stark against the burnt orange sky. The grand foyer felt colder than before, the air heavier. Richard carried a digital recorder, hoping to capture evidence of the strange phenomena. As they moved through the rooms, Emily couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. It wasn't just the creaking of the floorboards or the way the old walls seemed to exhale with the evening breeze, it was the undeniable feeling of eyes on her. They reached the master bedroom, where Emily hesitated. "The closet," she whispered. "It's in there." Richard nodded, turning on the recorder. Together, they descended the narrow staircase into the secret room. The air grew colder with each step. The room was exactly as they'd left it, but something felt wrong. The record player was now on the floor, its needle spinning aimlessly. The photograph Emily had touched was missing from the table. Richard clicked on his flashlight, its beam catching something scrawled on the far wall. The words, written in ash, sent a chill through them both. "Leave her be." "Who?" Emily asked aloud, her voice trembling. Before Richard could respond, the temperature in the room plummeted. The flashlight flickered, then died, leaving them in complete darkness. Then came the sound, the unmistakable rasp of a man's laughter, low and guttural, as if coming from every corner of the room. Emily fumbled for her phone, but her hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. She felt Richard's grip tighten on her arm. "Emily," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Look." She turned toward the staircase. A figure stood at the top, tall, broad-shouldered, backlit by the faint light from the bedroom above. The outline was unmistakable. A man in a suit, a cigarette dangling from his hand. Humphrey Bogart. But before Emily could process what she was seeing, the figure moved, descending the stairs with a deliberate, menacing pace. "Run," Richard hissed, yanking her toward the staircase. They scrambled up the narrow steps, the sound of heavy footsteps chasing them. When they burst into the bedroom, Emily slammed the closet door shut, her heart pounding. But the room wasn't empty. Standing by the window, bathed in the moonlight, was Lauren Bacall. Her face was serene, almost sorrowful, as she raised a hand and pointed back toward the closet. "He won't let you leave," she said softly, her voice laced with warning. Before Emily could react, the door slammed open, revealing the staircase below. But the room at the bottom was no longer the same. The walls glowed faintly, as if lit from within, revealing hundreds of photographs. Each one showed Bacall, Bogart, and others. "Richard," Emily whispered, stepping closer despite every instinct screaming at her to run. "Look at the faces." The photos weren't of guests or friends, they were of strangers. And in every one, the people were looking directly at the camera, their expressions frozen in terror. "What is this?" Richard muttered, his voice trembling. Then came the voice again, echoing through the house, louder this time, with an edge of anger. "You were told to leave." The door to the secret room slammed shut, and the house itself seemed to come alive. Walls groaned, lights flickered, and the faint strains of distorted jazz began to play from somewhere unseen. Emily turned to Richard, her breath catching in her throat. "We're not alone anymore," she whispered. And then the laughter started again. "Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." The laughter grew louder, deeper, reverberating through the very walls of the house. Emily's knees buckled, the oppressive weight of the sound forcing her to lean against the closet door for support. Richard tried to steady her, but his face was pale, his wide eyes betraying the terror he wouldn't voice. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the laughter stopped. The silence that followed was worse, thick and unnatural, broken only by the faint hum of the hidden record player restarting below them. "Do you hear that?" Richard asked, his voice barely audible. Emily nodded, her ears straining to make sense of the distorted sound drifting up the staircase. It wasn't jazz anymore. It was a voice, a woman's voice, singing a haunting melody, the lyrics muddled and just out of reach. "I think it's Lauren," Emily whispered. Richard shook his head, his expression grim. "No, that's not her." As they backed away from the closet, the bedroom seemed to stretch. The walls shifted subtly, the angles distorting until the doorway leading to the hall was no longer visible. "Where's the door?" Emily gasped, spinning around. Instead of the familiar layout of the house, They found themselves facing a narrow, dimly lit corridor that neither remembered. The wallpaper was old and peeling, a sickly green, and the faint smell of mildew wafted through the air. "This wasn't here before," Richard said, gripping Emily's arm. "This isn't possible." But the corridor seemed to beckon them, the light at the far end flickering as if daring them to follow. "We have to go," Emily whispered, though she wasn't sure if she meant toward the light or away from it. Richard hesitated, but before they could decide, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them, slow, deliberate, and far too close. "No choice now," he said, pulling her down the corridor. As they moved deeper into the passage, the air grew colder, and Emily swore she could hear whispers. They were faint at first, barely discernible, but as they progressed, the words became clearer. "Why didn't you stay?" one voice asked. "She doesn't belong here," another hissed. Emily's heart raced. She turned to Richard, but his focus was fixed ahead, his jaw clenched. The flickering light at the end of the corridor wasn't growing closer, it was moving away from them. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. The walls trembled, and Emily grabbed Richard's hand. "We need to go back," she pleaded. But when they turned around, the way they had come was gone. The corridor now stretched infinitely in both directions, an impossible maze of flickering lights and shadowed figures that seemed to move just beyond the edges of their vision. Just as panic began to set in, they stumbled into a room that wasn't part of the house or any house. The walls were blackened, charred as if by fire, and the ceiling was impossibly high, disappearing into darkness. In the center of the room stood a single chair. On it sat the missing photograph, propped up as if waiting for them. Emily approached cautiously, her every step echoing in the cavernous space. She reached for the photograph, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. The image had changed. It now showed her and Richard, standing in the exact room they were in, their faces frozen in the same expression of terror they'd seen on the strangers in the secret room. Before she could react, the chair creaked, the sound slicing through the silence. Emily stepped back, clutching the photo. "Emily," Richard whispered, pointing at the shadows in the corner of the room. Two figures emerged, their movements slow but purposeful. One was unmistakably Lauren Bacall, her gaze piercing, her lips set in a stern line. The other was Humphrey Bogart, his eyes darker than any photograph had captured, his cigarette glowing faintly in the dim light. But they weren't looking at Emily or Richard. They were looking past them. "They're here," Lauren said, her voice sharp and clear. "And they're not leaving." Richard turned, but before he could see what or who Lauren was addressing, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening finality. And then the growl returned, louder than before, shaking the very floor beneath them. The growl was no longer just a sound. It was a force, an undeniable presence that seemed to reverberate through every inch of the room. The floor beneath Emily and Richard trembled, and the very air thickened, as if the house itself were alive, suffocating them. The shadows that had once seemed distant now reached out, creeping toward them like cold, grasping hands. Emily felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of vertigo, as if the ground had tilted beneath her feet. She stumbled, but Richard caught her just in time. His grip was tight, but it didn't offer comfort. Instead, it anchored her to reality in the midst of something impossibly surreal. Bogart stepped forward first. His figure loomed tall, casting an ominous shadow that stretched across the blackened room. Emily instinctively took a step back, but the space seemed to close in around them. She couldn't breathe. The temperature had dropped again, and the familiar scent of cigar smoke filled the air stronger than before, more suffocating. Lauren Bacall's eyes, cold and unblinking, remained fixed on them. "They're not finished with you." Her voice was the same, but the emotion was gone, replaced by something darker, almost mechanical. Richard's voice shook. "What do you want from us?" Lauren didn't answer. Instead, she turned toward the shadows, and the figures within them began to move slowly at first, then faster. They weren't human. They were shapes, indistinct forms made of darkness and fog. Eyes glinted from the shadows, glowing like embers in the night. And then, from the farthest corner of the room, another voice joined the growl. It was high-pitched, almost frantic, a woman's voice. It was saying something, repeating a phrase over and over. "He won't let you go. He won't let you go." The room around them began to shift. The walls seemed to bend, the shadows twisting into grotesque shapes, elongating and contorting, as though they were being pulled into a different dimension. Richard's flashlight flickered again, casting fractured light onto the strange figures in the corners. They were moving closer, always just out of direct sight but never far enough to escape the feeling of something watching. Suddenly, a door appeared where none had been before, a plain wooden door, unmarked, its edges worn and scratched as though it had been opened and shut countless times. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't want to approach it, but something compelled her, a silent whisper from the shadows urging her to move. Without thinking, she reached for the doorknob. As her fingers closed around it, the growl intensified, as if the very act of touching it was an affront to whatever force controlled the house. With a swift motion, Emily turned the knob and stepped inside. The room beyond was unlike any other in the house. It was small, almost claustrophobic, and the air inside felt stale, like something had been sealed away for far too long. But it wasn't the oppressive atmosphere that made Emily freeze in place. It was the sight of the walls. They were covered in photographs. Hundreds of them. The photographs were of the same people they had seen earlier: Bacall, Bogart, strangers, but with a horrifying difference. Each photograph was distorted, faces blurred or scratched out, and in each one, a shadow stood just behind the person, a dark shape that seemed to reach for them, as if they were being watched, even in their most private moments. And in the center of the room was a pedestal, atop which rested a strange object. A small, tarnished box, intricate in design, with carvings of eyes and jagged lines that seemed to pulse with an unnatural light. "Do not open it," came the voice again, this time from behind Emily. She spun around. Lauren Bacall was standing in the doorway, her figure a silhouette in the dim light. But now, she was no longer the serene beauty from the photographs. Her eyes were wide, panicked. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "You can't open it," but it was too late. Emily's fingers, almost against her will, reached for the box. The moment she touched it, a cold wave washed over her. The shadows in the room stretched impossibly long, and the faint whispers grew louder, almost deafening. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were words, phrases, snippets of conversations, overlapping, disjointed, maddening. "He won't let you go. She's not the one he wants. The deal is made." Suddenly, the box snapped open with a sound that echoed like thunder, and from it something began to crawl out. It was slow at first, like smoke or shadow, but then it took form, something massive, something alien. It wasn't just a figure. It was an absence, a distortion in the air itself, the space around it warping and bending as if the laws of nature had broken down. Its presence was like a great weight, pushing down on everything in the room. Emily and Richard stumbled back, but they couldn't escape. The walls of the room seemed to close in on them, the air thickening. The entity's shape grew clearer, though its features remained indistinct, like a nightmare where everything had been blurred beyond recognition. But the eyes were clear. Two glowing, empty pits, staring at them with malevolent hunger. The voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was in their minds, invading their thoughts. "You opened it. Now you belong to me." And with that, the room began to spin, the world outside fading into nothingness. As the entity loomed over them, its presence crushing, Emily and Richard were paralyzed, unable to look away from the glowing eyes. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of voices swirling in their minds, each one pleading for mercy, for release, for escape. Then, in a moment of clarity amidst the chaos, Emily remembered the photographs, the ones with the strange, shadowed figures. She realized they weren't just ghosts. They were trapped. Without thinking, she grabbed Richard's hand. "We have to stop it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to close it." Richard nodded, his eyes filled with fear but also a glimmer of resolve. Together, they bolted toward the pedestal, knocking the box from its resting place. The entity let out a howl, an inhuman sound that rattled the very foundations of the house. But they didn't stop. Emily yanked the box shut, and the room seemed to freeze. The entity's form flickered, its glowing eyes dimming, its form disintegrating into nothingness. The oppressive air lightened, and the whispers faded into silence. The room fell still, the house seeming to hold its breath. Then, like a final exhale, the oppressive pressure lifted. The shadows retreated, and Lauren Bacall's figure vanished into the air. Her last words echoing softly, "You're free now." The door to the hallway opened, and Emily and Richard stumbled out, gasping for air. They didn't look back. As they stepped into the fading light of dawn, the house behind them fell silent. But the feeling of something unfinished lingered, something they could never quite escape, no matter how far they ran. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.